iron, over those distances.
So what you're saying is it's not cost effective for the national grid to reach out to those communities, and that's, I assume, where you step in.
Yeah, unless you do it in a distributed way, where the generation is also distributed.
But the CEB, for example, under the new the power energy plan, is the distribution is going to be broken up. Isn't that the case?
Well, they have what their plan is really to separate the generation, distribution, and the transmission.
Yeah, and is there a timeline for that?
Well, there have been timelines, but they've never been met, I guess, because of various reasons.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I want to step back a bit from this. I think by virtue of looking at this on television, many of the audience would not know what it is not to have electricity. I mean, many of us would have been born into a household and certainly a life which took electricity for granted. We would not be able to imagine what it would be like without a life without electricity. Now, you, I would understand, would have encountered communities who the first time they would have switched on a light switch would have been through the alternative energy sources that you've enabled on the ground. Have you any stories to tell us about what it is like for those families?
Yes, I think few things kind of stick out in my mind. I mean, one big surprise we got was we all assumed certain things like what would they like to do with electricity, and one thing which we never expected was one of the things which they like most and was the electric iron, and why was really a pleasant surprise. It's because they would love to iron the uniform of their children when they go to school. So those were very pleasant things. The other thing were the evenings, because a lot of them, in those villages, by 6:30 they kind of shut off because it's dark. Maybe there are elephants. Whereas with electricity, how I looked at it and what I saw was that the evenings became pleasanter. So I think those were things which we really didn't imagine because we were so used to them in a way,
and so did they go? Did they go and buy TVs and stuff like that? And then
well, actually, there were very interesting cases. I wouldn't say that because people are more pragmatic than what we think. Again, and we would imagine that they would buy a TV, but actually there were homes where they bought TVs and they gave the TVs away. In fact, the kids, I know of a particular home where the children said, look, I think this TV is a nuisance because it's kind of really not allowing us to study, so let's gift it to another family. There were cases like that as well. Although, we speak of TV.
And we talked about fossil fuels. I want to just read something that Ray Vijayawardena, who's a noted Sri Lankan inventor, wrote in July 2004, which is actually off one of your websites, and he notes that, and I quote, "A very limited quantum of solar energy and wind power can be harnessed," in talking about Sri Lanka, at very high cost for remote areas. However, this does not yet, nor for the foreseeable future, appear to be available in larger quantities and at prices needed for national development. Therefore, our future increases in energy will necessarily be thermal, i.e. some fossil fuel will have to be burned. Now, you're into alternative energy, but there is also the suggestion that you cannot run away from the fact that Sri Lanka will be energy dependent on oil and coal. Now, how much of what you're doing will kind of vitiate the economic dangers of having to actually spend a lot of your expenditure on this on fossil fuels?
Well, I think, like as we discussed before, if biomass can be scaled up in a more distributed way, yes, we can mitigate the requirement for thermal generation of fossil fuel.
By how much, Lalith?
Yes. The question is like, what is the commitment we want to make? Because if, for example, if we were to say take the Coconut Triangle, which is the western part of Sri Lanka, just 1/3 of that land, if it could be a mixed plantation, in between the coconut plant like Lilisedia, we could meet all the energy requirements of the western province for industry, for example, with that kind of plantation. So that's the scale we are talking, but we need to.
And what kind of, I mean, spell it out. What kind of commitment would you need, say, from the state or the government to do that?
Well, I think we need to encourage, like we have very good entrepreneurship in Sri Lanka. People are willing to take risks, people are willing to invest, but the awareness, the infrastructure is what is preventing a lot of investment today. So we need to look at energy.
In terms of the investment infrastructure?
Yes. I mean, for example, if somebody is thinking a medium-term entrepreneur or a small entrepreneur is thinking of investing in a Denro power plant, there are certain obstacles are there which, for example, how does he connect to the grid, the national grid? Things like that. If there can be some facilitation there where the grid is, for example, given to his doorstep, I think the investment can happen, and the building of the awareness that these things are possible, because we still think 10 years behind in terms of that everything big is what we need and the mega investment is what is needed, whereas the world in a way is going away from that type of idea, and so we need to cultivate that habit here.
But I mean, you're in a sense a living example of just having managed those challenges and having met them and actually having done what you're talking about. What is it now? 7 villages and 3 larger scale projects. I mean, what is the lesson that you take from your experience with an unresponsive state?
Well, I think the lesson I learned is really what. I remember early on I was reading about this. There's a famous person called Buckminster Fuller who lived in America, and he said that the only way to change the existing reality is build a model which will make the existing reality obsolete. So in a way we have these concrete structures in Sri Lanka, the institutions which are not willing to change, and if we were to just throw stones at them, they would hardly notice, which is what a lot of us are trying to do, because that's our gut reaction. Let's destroy them. But I think the advice I would give to the entrepreneurs is build the alternatives. I think the tea industry has shown it, because I don't think whether you remember, but when we were young, when we were small boys, if we were to ask our parents, would you build a tea factory, they would say, look, no, that's for the big companies. But today, virtually every successful tea factory is owned by a small entrepreneur. The big companies are gone. In fact, the latest statistics show that only 30% of our tea production is from the big companies. The rest are small entrepreneurs, village, town level people who build the tea factories and who are successfully doing that. So I think my answer would be, of course you need a balance, you need the state to provide certain amount of facilitation, but the rest should be an alternative model we need to build.
You did an experiment in Pokurutan, is that right? And was there anything unique about that? Or
well, I think the uniqueness there is we kind of experimented with several technologies there. Again, as usual, starting with the high end of the scale and realizing that really that's not what's always right.
Explain that. What would the high end?
The high end was the solar wind type technology as a solution to energy, and by experimenting with different technologies, we also realize it's not just a technology. People should also be able to buy into it. That's an advantage in biomass, where the villagers in fact can understand how the technology works, because it's fairly straightforward.
But is it also the case, Lalith, that there is an economic incentive for them in biomass? I think the figures are something, I think you provided them, around 90,000 per family per year.
Right, definitely.
Whereas in the case of solar or say wind, you just put them up and they generate electricity. But I mean, that's an interesting argument. I've never heard it before. But is that
that's really true, because if you take a hydropower plant, yes, when you're building it, there may be certain economic benefits to the people right around. But once it's operating, there's hardly anything. Whereas a biomass